Hey everyone, welcome back to Mimi Horror Stories. Tonight, we're bringing you another episode of spine-tingling horror tales set against the calming sound of rain to help you relax and drift off to sleep. So, get comfortable, hit that like button, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Semblance of comfort. As I drove along the winding country road, something caught my eye. There, on the side of the road, stood a woman dressed in a flowing white dress. She seemed out of place, standing so still in the darkness. My heart skipped a beat. I considered driving past, but something compelled me to stop. I pulled over and rolled down my window. "Are you all right?" I called out. She turned to face me, and I could see her eyes glistening with tears. "I need help," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. I got out of the car and approached her. She looked pale and fragile, as if she might disappear at any moment. "What happened?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She pointed down the road, towards a dark, wooded area. "My car broke down. I need to get home," she whispered. I offered her a ride, and she nodded gratefully. We got back into the car, and she directed me to a small, unmarked road leading into the woods. The air grew colder as we drove deeper into the forest, the trees closing in around us. As we drove, I tried to make conversation. "What's your name?" I asked. She remained silent, staring straight ahead. I felt a growing unease, but I pushed it aside. After what felt like an eternity, she finally spoke. "Just here," she said, pointing to a clearing up ahead. I stopped the car, and she turned to me, her eyes filled with sorrow. "Thank you," she whispered, before stepping out of the car. I watched as she walked towards the edge of the clearing, her white dress glowing faintly in the darkness. I waited for a moment, expecting her to wave or give some indication that she was all right, but she simply vanished into the night. I felt a chill run down my spine. Something didn't feel right. I turned the car around and headed back to the main road, my mind racing. When I reached the safety of the highway, I pulled over to gather my thoughts. I decided to call the local police, just in case she needed more help. The officer who answered listened to my story, and then asked me to meet him at the station. When I arrived, he showed me a photograph. "Is this the woman you saw?" he asked. My blood ran cold as I recognized her face. "Yes, that's her," I replied. The officer sighed and shook his head. "She's been missing for years," he said. "Many people have reported seeing her on that road, but no one knows what happened to her. They say she wanders the woods, looking for help, but when someone stops, she vanishes." I left the station feeling a mix of fear and sadness. To this day, I can't shake the image of her standing by the roadside, her eyes pleading for help. Every time I drive down a lonely road at night, I can't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the woman in white, forever seeking the way home. I've always enjoyed taking late night drives. There's something about the empty roads and the quiet of the night that I find calming. One night, I decided to take a route I hadn't driven in years, a lonely stretch of road that winds through a dense forest. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the trees. As I drove, I saw something up ahead on the side of the road. It was an old, abandoned car. It seemed out of place, just sitting there with its driver's door ajar. Curious, I pulled over to take a closer look. I got out of my car and approached the abandoned vehicle. The air felt colder as I neared it, and a sense of unease settled over me. The car was covered in a thin layer of dust, as if it had been there for some time, but there was something else: fresh bloodstains on the driver's seat and the steering wheel. My heart began to race. I looked around, half expecting to see someone emerging from the woods, but there was nothing but silence. I debated calling the police, but my phone had no signal. I decided to investigate further, hoping to find some clue about what had happened. I checked the back seat and the trunk, but found nothing. The more I looked, the stronger the feeling of dread grew. It was as if the car itself was trying to tell me something terrible had happened here. Suddenly, I heard a rustling sound coming from the trees. I froze, listening intently. The sound grew louder, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I hurried back to my car, glancing over my shoulder as I went. The abandoned car seemed to loom larger in the moonlight, a dark presence against the pale road. I got back into my car and locked the doors, my hands shaking. As I started the engine, I saw movement in my rearview mirror. A shadowy figure was standing near the abandoned car, watching me. I couldn't make out any features, but the figure's presence was menacing. I hit the gas and sped away, my mind racing. I drove straight to the nearest town and found a place with cell reception. I called the police and reported what I had seen. They assured me they would investigate and asked for my details. A few days later, I received a call from the police. They had found the car, but there was no sign of the bloodstains or the figure I had seen. They asked if I was sure about what I had witnessed, and I insisted that I was. It was well past midnight, and I was alone on a long stretch of highway. My fuel gauge was dangerously low, and the road ahead was empty. Just as I started to panic, a flickering neon sign appeared through the fog of a gas station. Relieved, I pulled in, but an unsettling chill crept over me. The place looked frozen in time, with peeling paint and flickering lights casting eerie shadows. I parked by a pump and got out, scanning the area. There wasn't a soul in sight, but the lights inside the station were on, so I headed for the door. Inside, the air was stale and heavy. An old man stood behind the counter, his eyes fixed on me as if he'd been expecting someone. "Evening," he said, in a voice that grated like sandpaper. "Need some gas?" I nodded, trying to ignore the unease gnawing at me. As I walked back to my car, I noticed the other pumps were covered in cobwebs, as if they hadn't been used in years. I shook off the feeling and started fueling up. When I returned to pay, the old man leaned forward, his gaze unnerving. "Where you headed?" he asked, voice low. "Just passing through," I replied, feigning confidence. He handed me my change, his fingers cold as ice. "Be careful out there," he warned. "Strange things happen on these roads at night." His words sent a chill racing down my spine. Hurrying back to my car, I started the engine and drove away. Glancing in the rearview mirror, the old man was still there, watching me with those piercing eyes. A few miles down the road, my radio crackled to life with strange static. I fiddled with the dial, but it wouldn't change. The static rose to an unbearable pitch, then abruptly stopped, plunging the car into eerie silence. As I drove on, the fog thickened, and I felt a growing sense of dread. Suddenly, headlights appeared ahead, cutting through the mist. A car approached, its windows dark and inscrutable. As it passed, I glanced over and froze. The driver was the old man from the gas station, his expression blank, eyes locked straight ahead. My heart pounded as I pressed the accelerator, desperate to escape. When I finally reached home, I felt a wave of relief, but the encounter haunted me. Later, I discovered the gas station had been abandoned for years, ever since a string of mysterious disappearances on that highway. It was a late Saturday night, and I was driving home after visiting a friend in a nearby town. The highway was deserted, the only light coming from my headlights cutting through the darkness. I enjoyed the solitude of night drives, the quiet and the sense of calm they brought. But this night would be different. I was about halfway home when I heard a faint sound that didn't belong. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but as I slowed down and rolled down the window, I heard it more clearly. It was the unmistakable sound of a baby crying, echoing through the night. I pulled over to the side of the road, the crying growing louder and more desperate. My heart raced as I stepped out of the car, the cool night air sending a shiver down my spine. I grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment and started towards the source of the sound, which seemed to be coming from the dense woods lining the road. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. "Is someone there?" The crying continued, a pitiful wail that tugged at my heart. I pushed through the underbrush, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. After a few minutes of searching, I came to a small clearing. The crying seemed to be coming from just beyond it. As I stepped into the clearing, the crying abruptly stopped. The sudden silence was deafening. I swung the flashlight around, trying to see if I could spot anything, but there was nothing, just trees and shadows. Feeling a growing sense of unease, I decided to head back to the car. As I turned, my flashlight caught something on the ground, an old, tattered blanket. It looked like it had been there for years, partially buried under fallen leaves. My heart pounded as I picked it up. There was no sign of a baby, no footprints, nothing to indicate anyone had been there recently. I rushed back to my car, my mind racing. I slammed the door shut, locking it for good measure. As I sat there, trying to calm down, I heard the crying again, this time fainter, as if it were moving away from the road. I put the car in gear and sped off, the sound fading into the distance. It was an unusually cold night, and I was driving home on a remote stretch of highway, far from any signs of civilization. The road was straight, but the trees on either side seemed to close in, their shadows stretching across the asphalt like dark, looming fingers. The only light came from my car's headlights, piercing the darkness. The quiet was unsettling. Just as I started to relax into the rhythmic hum of the engine, something strange happened. My car suddenly jolted, and the engine sputtered. The headlights flickered, then dimmed to a ghostly glow. I pressed the accelerator, but the car seemed to be mired in an invisible quagmire. I gripped the steering wheel, trying to maintain control, but the car felt like it was moving through thick sludge. The brakes were barely responding, and I could see the trees coming closer and closer. My pulse quickened, and panic set in. I tried to pull over, but the car wouldn't cooperate. It felt as though an unseen force was holding it back. I finally managed to bring the car to a stop on the side of the road, the engine still sputtering. I stepped out, my breath visible in the cold air. The silence was deafening. The road seemed normal, no ice, no debris. My car, however, seemed to be enveloped in an eerie stillness. As I tried to figure out what was wrong, I noticed something strange. The air around the car felt unnaturally cold, almost icy. A shiver ran down my spine as I heard a low, distant hum that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The sound grew louder, a relentless drone that seemed to seep into my bones. I got back into the car, desperate to leave. When I restarted the engine, it roared to life as if nothing had happened. The headlights were bright again, and the car felt perfectly normal. Relieved, I drove off, but my nerves were on edge. The road ahead seemed to stretch into an abyss. Every shadow seemed to move, and I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following me. The hum from earlier faded, but the oppressive silence that replaced it was equally unsettling. When I finally reached home, I was shaken. I couldn't get the incident out of my mind, so I decided to investigate. The next day, I returned to the spot in broad daylight. The road was clear, the trees were just trees, and there was no sign of anything unusual. But the locals I spoke to had their own stories. They spoke of a stretch of road where cars inexplicably lose power and control. Some believed it was due to a magnetic anomaly. Others whispered of a tragic accident from years ago, a driver who had died under mysterious circumstances. It was one of those nights where the road seemed to stretch on endlessly. I had been driving for hours, trying to get home after a long day. The night was quiet, the kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of every little sound. I was halfway through my journey when I began to feel an inexplicable chill. My car's interior was perfectly warm, but the feeling of cold was unsettling. I kept glancing into the rearview mirror, but everything seemed normal, just the empty back seat behind me. As I continued driving, the chill intensified. It was as if the temperature in the car was dropping rapidly. I adjusted the heater, but it didn't make a difference. The cold persisted, and I began to feel increasingly uneasy. Every now and then, I would glance over my shoulder into the back seat, half expecting to see something, but it was always empty. Then, I felt a cold, heavy presence in the back of the car. I spun around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there, just the usual back seat with the shadowy outlines of the car's interior. I tried to brush it off as exhaustion, but the feeling wouldn't go away. The sensation grew more intense, and I could almost feel a cold breath on the back of my neck. It was as if someone or something was right behind me, just out of sight. I pulled over to the side of the road, turned on the interior light, and checked the back seat thoroughly. There was nothing there, no sign of anything out of the ordinary. Feeling slightly reassured, but still on edge, I got back into the car and continued my drive. The oppressive cold seemed to follow me, and every little noise made me jump. I kept my eyes on the road and my hands tightly gripping the steering wheel, my anxiety growing with every mile. When I finally reached home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been in the back seat with me. I checked the car thoroughly again, but everything was as it should be. I spent the rest of the night restless, replaying every moment in my head. It was well past midnight, and I had been driving for hours on an isolated highway, feeling the fatigue of the journey. My stomach was growling, and I was desperate for a break. As I rounded a bend, a dim, flickering neon sign caught my eye. A diner, of all things, in the middle of nowhere. Relieved, I pulled into the parking lot, hoping for a quick bite. The moment I walked through the door, an uneasy feeling settled over me. The diner was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made every small noise seem amplified. The neon lights outside barely illuminated the dusty interior, casting strange, dancing shadows on the walls. I was greeted by a bell's soft jingle and an elderly woman behind the counter. Her smile was tired and vacant, her eyes distant as she handed me a menu. I noticed her hands were shaking slightly as she set it down. I took a seat at the counter, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease. The diner's booths were occupied, but by figures shrouded in shadows, their faces hidden from view. I could feel their eyes on me, though none of them moved or spoke. The stillness was unnerving. When I ordered, the elderly woman disappeared into the back, leaving me alone with the unsettling ambience. The patrons continued to watch me, their gazes unblinking and cold. The silence grew heavier, and the dim lights seemed to flicker more frequently. Moments later, the woman returned with my food, her movements robotic. As she placed the plate in front of me, her eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. I tried to eat, but the food tasted bland and unappetizing. Every bite felt like a chore as the oppressive atmosphere weighed on me. Without warning, the power went out. The entire diner plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow of the neon sign outside, casting eerie shadows through the windows. The silence was now punctuated by an occasional creak and the soft hum of something just out of sight. I fumbled for my phone to use as a flashlight, but the moment I switched it on, the diner's lights flickered back to life. The elderly woman and the patrons remained exactly as they were, their expressions unchanged, their stares more intense than before. My unease escalated. I finished my meal quickly, paid at the counter, and made a beeline for the door. As I turned to leave, I glanced back at the diner. The woman and the patrons were still watching me, their eyes following my every move. Their faces seemed even more distorted in the flickering light. Once outside, I hurried to my car and started driving, my heart racing. The feeling of being watched didn't leave me as I drove away. I couldn't shake the image of those vacant eyes staring through the window. The next day, I researched the diner and found out it had been closed for years. There were rumors that on some nights, it would appear as if it were still operational. Locals spoke of strange occurrences and ghostly figures in the diner, trapped in a timeless loop. It was the Great Depression, and the trains became a lifeline for many desperate souls seeking work, food, or a mere semblance of hope. I was one of those hobos, riding the rails in search of a better tomorrow. But what I found was far more sinister. Kingsbury Run was a notorious spot, a grimy, industrial stretch in Cleveland where the tracks converged. It was a haven for the down and out, a place where you could blend into the shadows and disappear. But it was also the hunting ground for a monster. I first heard the rumors from other hobos. They spoke in hushed tones about a killer who preyed on men like us, dismembering his victims and leaving their bodies scattered like gruesome jigsaw pieces. They called him the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. I dismissed the stories as fear-mongering until the night I encountered him. It was a cold, moonless night when I arrived at Kingsbury Run. The air was thick with the stench of industry and decay. I found a spot near an old, rusted railcar to hunker down for the night. As I settled in, I heard a soft, almost rhythmic chopping sound. My curiosity got the better of me, and I crept closer to investigate. What I saw chilled me to the bone. There, in the dim light of a flickering lantern, A figure was hunched over something on the ground. The unmistakable scent of blood filled the air. I watched in horror as the figure methodically hacked at a lifeless body, dismembering it with a terrifying precision. My stomach churned, and I fought the urge to retch. I must have made a sound, for the figure suddenly stopped and looked up. Our eyes met, and I saw nothing but cold, calculating madness in his gaze. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing near another group of hobos who had made a fire for warmth. I told them what I had seen, my voice trembling. Their faces reflected my fear, and we all knew we had to get out of Kingsbury Run. The next morning, we boarded the first train out, leaving behind the grim specter of the Mad Butcher. Dozen men remain nameless, their lives reduced to grisly headlines and cold case files. The memory of that night still haunts me, a reminder of the darkness that can lurk in the most unexpected places. Even now, whenever I hear the distant wail of a train whistle, I think of Kingsbury Run and the monster who prowled its shadows. The Great Depression took many things from us: our jobs, our homes, our dignity. But for some, it also took their lives, stolen by a madman who remains a ghost in the annals of history. It was a sweltering day in the summer of 2004 when the news broke. A college student had been found murdered near the abandoned train tracks in New York City. I remember it vividly because it shook our community to its core. She was a bright and talented student, full of life and promise. We often saw her jogging in the park or heading to classes, always with a smile on her face. That day, she went out for her usual run, but never returned. The search began almost immediately. Friends, family, and even strangers combed the city, hoping to find her safe and sound. Days passed with no sign of her, and our hope began to wane. Then, one morning, a jogger discovered her lifeless body near the old, rusted train tracks, hidden beneath a canopy of overgrown weeds and debris. The scene was horrific. She had been strangled, and her body showed signs of a brutal struggle. The police cordoned off the area, turning the once peaceful park into a somber crime scene. Yellow tape fluttered in the breeze, a stark contrast to the vibrant green of the surrounding trees. As the investigation unfolded, the details only added to the horror. She had been attacked and overpowered, her final moments filled with terror. The police canvassed the area, interviewed countless people, and followed up on numerous leads, but the killer remained elusive. Rumors and theories spread like wildfire. Some believed it was a random attack by a transient or someone familiar with the area. Others thought it might have been a planned assault by someone she knew. The uncertainty and fear gripped us all. In the weeks that followed, memorials and vigils were held in her honor. The community came together to mourn and to demand justice. Her family was devastated, their grief palpable as they pleaded for any information that might lead to the arrest of the person responsible. Despite the efforts of law enforcement, the case went cold. There were no witnesses, no concrete evidence, and no suspect to bring to justice. The killer had vanished, leaving behind only pain and unanswered questions. Years have passed since that tragic day, but the memory of her life and the brutal way it was taken from her still lingers. Every time I pass by those old train tracks, I am reminded of the senseless violence and the bright future that was stolen from her. The investigation remains open, and her family continues to hope for closure. They deserve answers, and she deserves justice. Until that day comes, we hold on to the memories of her kindness, her joy, and the light she brought into our lives, and we remain vigilant, hoping that one day, the truth will finally come to light. It was the summer of 1946, and the small town of Texarkana was buzzing with its usual southern charm and quiet routine. But the calm was shattered when a series of brutal attacks began, casting a dark shadow over the community. I remember that summer vividly. The town was gripped by fear as the so-called Phantom Killer struck with chilling precision. It all started one night when a young couple parked at a secluded spot near the edge of town. The Phantom Killer approached their car and, without warning, attacked them. The violence was sudden and merciless. The girl survived but was left severely injured, while the boy was tragically killed. The news of the attack spread quickly, and the town was thrown into a state of panic. People began locking their doors and avoiding the quiet, secluded areas that once felt safe. Then, just a few weeks later, the killer struck again, this time targeting another couple. They too were attacked while parked in a remote area. The details of the crime were horrific, with the victim suffering from the same brutal treatment as the first pair. As the summer wore on, the attacks continued. The phantom killer seemed to appear and disappear like a ghost, always eluding capture. Each attack followed a similar pattern: young couples, isolated locations, and an overwhelming sense of terror. The police were stumped, with no leads and no clear motive. The entire town was on edge. Rumors swirled about the killer's identity, and every shadow seemed to hold a hint of danger. Local authorities, alongside state and federal investigators, worked tirelessly, but the killer remained elusive. Witnesses reported seeing a masked figure, but their descriptions were vague and conflicting. Despite the intense investigation and widespread media coverage, the phantom killer was never caught. As quickly as the attacks had begun, they stopped, leaving the town with more questions than answers. The fear and anxiety slowly faded, but the memory of those brutal nights lingered. To this day, the identity of the phantom killer remains unknown. The case has become a chilling reminder of the fragility of safety and the shadows that can lurk even in the most seemingly tranquil places. The people of Texarkana still remember those dark days, a somber testament to the terror that once gripped their community. It was a warm summer evening in 2003 when I last saw them. The couple, full of life and excitement, were headed to Australia for what was supposed to be a memorable adventure. They were traveling by train, something they always enjoyed. But what began as a joyous trip turned into an unsettling mystery. I remember the night they disappeared. The train was running smoothly, making its way through the scenic Australian countryside. It was supposed to be a relaxing journey, but as the hours passed, something felt off. The couple seemed to vanish without a trace, leaving no indication of their departure. Initially, everyone thought it was just a misunderstanding. Maybe they had gotten off at an earlier stop or missed their connection. But as the train rolled on and they didn't reappear, worry began to set in. The crew and fellow passengers were baffled. The train had been checked thoroughly. Their belongings were still in their compartments, but there was no sign of them. The authorities were alerted, and a massive search was launched. Police combed through the train routes, interviewed witnesses, and checked nearby stations, but there were no clues. It was as if the couple had simply evaporated into thin air. The only thing that seemed certain was that they had not left the train voluntarily. Rumors began to swirl. Some thought they might have been involved in a criminal act or foul play, while others speculated about a more sinister reason for their disappearance. The more the investigation unfolded, the more mysterious their vanishing became. Months passed, and the case grew colder. The search gradually tapered off, and the couple's disappearance remained unresolved. The authorities were left with only fragmented theories and a troubling sense of unanswered questions. The train they had been on continued its routes, but the mystery of what happened to them cast a long shadow over the railway. To this day, the fate of that couple remains one of Australia's eerie unsolved mysteries. Whenever I hear about strange disappearances or unsettling stories on the news, I can't help but think of that summer evening and the couple who vanished without a trace. It's a stark reminder of how even the most ordinary journeys can end in the most inexplicable ways. It was a crisp autumn day in 1966 when the disaster struck. I was living in Wales, not far from Aberfan, a small mining village nestled in the hills. The coal slurry tip, a massive pile of waste from the local mine, had been a constant presence in our lives. We knew it was dangerous, but no one expected it would cause such devastation. That morning, everything seemed normal. The village was bustling with its usual activity as people went about their daily routines. The children were excited, looking forward to a day at school. But as the day wore on, a series of tremors began to shake the area, and soon the worst happened. Without warning, the slurry tip, saturated with water and instability, gave way. A massive wave of coal waste surged down the hill, engulfing everything in its path. I remember the horror of seeing the sludge pour into the village, swallowing houses, roads, and tragically, the school where so many children were. The aftermath was heart-wrenching. The rescue efforts were frantic, with teams of volunteers and emergency responders digging through the muck to save anyone they could. The train station, which had previously been a place of routine departures and arrivals, became the site of somber coordination and relief efforts. It was there that the true scale of the tragedy began to sink in. Over the next few days, the town was a hive of activity, but the mood was somber. The loss was immense. 144 people, including 116 children, had been killed. The wreckage left behind was a stark reminder of the fragility of life and the hidden dangers that lurked in our everyday surroundings. The horror of Aberfan lingered in my mind long after the immediate aftermath. Even now, whenever I hear the distant rumble of a train or see coal heaps, I am reminded of that day. The tragedy was a dark chapter in our village's history, a reminder of the unexpected and devastating consequences of neglect and oversight. To this day, the memory of Aberfan serves as a somber lesson in the importance of safety and vigilance. The disaster remains a poignant example of how quickly life can be upended, and how the echoes of such tragedies continue to reverberate through the years. It was late at night in 2007 when I boarded the train in Japan, heading home after a long day. The atmosphere was quiet, with most passengers either asleep or lost in their thoughts. But something about that night felt different, as if an invisible presence was watching us. As the train chugged along its route, an unsettling feeling settled over me. I glanced around, noticing a few other passengers looking equally uneasy. The lights flickered intermittently, adding to the eerie ambience. I tried to shake off the feeling and focused on the rhythmic clatter of the wheels. But then, things took a turn for the bizarre. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a shadowy figure moving through the carriage. It was unlike any passenger I had ever seen. Its form seemed to waver and shift, as though it wasn't quite solid. I tried to convince myself it was just fatigue playing tricks on my mind, but the figure persisted. A few moments later, other passengers began to murmur and point towards the same spot. Someone mentioned they had seen the figure as well. The tension in the carriage was palpable. The train conductor was alerted, and he came through the carriage, looking concerned but unable to spot anything unusual. When we reached the next station, a few passengers decided to leave the train early, shaken by the strange encounter. The station staff were notified, and they assured us they would investigate. As the train continued on its journey, the figure was nowhere to be seen, but the unease remained. The following day, news spread that similar eerie sightings had been reported on other trains in the area. Passengers spoke of ghostly figures and unexplained phenomena, contributing to the legend of the ghost train in Japan. The experiences seemed to converge around the same unsettling figure I had seen, and the stories only added to the mystery. To this day, the memory of that night lingers with me. The sensation of an otherworldly presence on that seemingly ordinary train ride remains vivid. Every time I board a train now, I can't help but feel a twinge of apprehension, wondering if the spectral figure will make another appearance. I've always believed that the quiet, lonely nights on the train held a certain charm. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels, the soft hum of the engine, and the occasional whistle breaking the silence, it all seemed so serene. But that night, everything changed. I was a passenger on the last train of the evening, heading to the end of the line. The carriage was nearly empty, save for a few tired commuters and myself. I settled into my seat, pulled out a book, and tried to lose myself in its pages. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As the train sped through the dark countryside, I noticed a figure moving stealthily through the carriages. He seemed to be searching for something or someone. His eyes darted around, and his movements were tense. I tried to ignore him, convincing myself that it was none of my business. But then, a chilling scream pierced the night. The entire carriage froze. My heart pounded as I looked around, trying to locate the source of the scream. It came from a few seats behind me. Slowly, I turned and saw the figure from earlier standing over a lifeless body. Blood pooled around the victim, staining the floor a deep crimson. Panic ensued. Passengers scrambled to move away, some crying, others shouting for help. But we were trapped. The train continued its relentless journey, the end of the line still miles away. The figure made no move to escape. Instead, he stood there, staring at his handiwork with the cold, detached expression. I reached for my phone, but there was no signal. Desperation clawed at me as I realized we had to wait until the next station to call for help. The minutes dragged on, each second feeling like an eternity. The murderer, sensing our helplessness, calmly walked to the end of the carriage and sat down, as if nothing had happened. When we finally reached the station, the police were waiting. Someone must have alerted them earlier. The murderer was apprehended without resistance. As they led him away, he turned and looked at me, his eyes devoid of emotion. That gaze haunts me to this day. The investigation revealed that the victim and the murderer had a history, a tale of betrayal and revenge that culminated in that horrifying night. But for those of us on that train, it was an experience that shattered the illusion of safety the night train once held. It was a cold winter evening, and my delivery route had taken me through unfamiliar, winding roads. The snow was falling heavily, and visibility was low. Suddenly, my GPS flickered and died, leaving me stranded in the middle of a dense, dark forest. Panic set in as I realized I had no signal and no idea how to find my way back. After what felt like hours of wandering aimlessly, I saw a faint, flickering light through the trees. My heart raced as I drove towards it, hoping it was a sign of help. As I got closer, I saw an old man standing at the edge of the forest, holding a lantern. His face was weathered, and his eyes seemed to shine with an eerie light. Despite his unsettling appearance, I was relieved to see another person. "Excuse me, sir," I called out, my voice trembling. "I'm lost. Can you help me find my way back to the main road?" The old man nodded slowly and pointed down a narrow, overgrown path. "Follow this path," he said in a raspy voice. "It will lead you back to where you need to go." I thanked him and drove off, occasionally glancing in my rearview mirror to see if he was still there. But as soon as I turned the corner, he vanished without a trace. I shrugged it off as a trick of the light and continued driving, my nerves on edge. Eventually, found my way back to the main road and completed my deliveries. Later that night, I mentioned the encounter to some locals at a diner. Their faces went pale when I described the old man. "That's impossible," one of them said. "The man you saw died in a car accident on that very road years ago. People say his ghost appears to help lost travelers find their way." A chill ran down my spine as I realized I had been guided by the ghost of a man who had perished on that same road. The memory of his eerie, shining eyes still haunts me to this day. It was a typical Friday night, and I was out on my usual delivery route. I had just picked up a package from the warehouse, and my next stop was a house I had never been to before. The address was in a quiet neighborhood, but something about it seemed off. When I arrived, the house looked normal enough, though it was older and a bit run down. I walked up to the front door and knocked. After a few moments, the door creaked open, and an elderly woman appeared. She had a kind smile and thanked me as she took the package. I thought nothing of it and headed back to my truck. But as I reached the sidewalk, I felt a chill run down my spine. I glanced back at the house and saw the elderly woman standing in the window, staring at me with an unsettling intensity. Shrugging it off, I got into my truck and drove away. The rest of the night went smoothly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. When I got home, I tried to forget about it, but the image of her staring at me stayed in my mind. The next morning, curiosity got the best of me. I decided to look up the address to see if I could find any information about the house or its occupants. What I discovered left me frozen in place. The house had been abandoned for years, and the last known resident, an elderly woman, had died under mysterious circumstances. I couldn't believe it. I had seen her, talked to her, and handed her a package. My mind raced with questions. Who had I delivered to? What was in the package? And why was she staring at me so intensely? Later that day, I went back to the house to see if I could find any answers. As I approached, the door was ajar, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Stepping inside, the house was empty, covered in dust and cobwebs. There was no sign of life, no sign of anyone having been there. But then, on the floor of the living room, I saw the package I had delivered, unopened and untouched. I picked it up and left the house, my heart pounding in my chest. I never found out what was in that package, and I never went back to that neighborhood again. The experience left me shaken, and to this day, I can't explain what happened. But one thing is for sure, I'll never forget the night I delivered a package to a ghost. It was late, and I was finishing up my delivery route for the night. My last stop was a bit out of the way, down a long, winding road. After dropping off the package, I hopped back into my truck and started heading back to the main road. As I drove, I heard a faint knocking sound coming from the back of the truck. At first, I thought it might be something shifting around, so I pulled over to check. I opened the back and looked inside, but everything seemed in place. There was no sign of anything that could have caused the noise. Shrugging it off, I got back into the driver's seat and continued driving. But after a few minutes, the knocking started again, louder this time. It was a steady, rhythmic knock, like someone tapping insistently. My heart began to race, and I pulled over again, more urgently this time. I opened the back of the truck and searched every corner, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. No loose items, no animals, nothing that could explain the sound. Feeling uneasy, I decided to ignore it and just get back to the warehouse as quickly as possible. As I drove, the knocking continued, growing louder and more insistent. It felt like it was coming from right behind me, and every hair on the back of my neck stood up. I turned up the radio, trying to drown out the sound, but it only seemed to get louder. Finally, I reached the warehouse. I jumped out of the truck and practically ran to the back, determined to find the source of the noise once and for all. But when I opened the doors, there was nothing. No sound, no movement, just the eerie silence of the empty truck. I reported the incident to my supervisor, but they brushed it off as a trick of the mind, maybe caused by exhaustion. But I knew what I heard. Those knocks were real, and they haunted me for days. Every time I got into that truck, I braced myself for the knocking to start again. It never did, but the memory of that night stayed with me, a chilling reminder that sometimes, the scariest things are the ones we can't explain. It was a typical evening on my delivery route, and I had just received an order for a house I hadn't been to before. The address was in a part of town I rarely visited, but I punched it into my GPS and headed out. As I drove, I noticed the neighborhood becoming more and more run down. Finally, I arrived at the given address, only to find a charred, dilapidated structure that looked like it had burned down years ago. Confused, I double-checked the address, but it was correct. I got out of my car and walked cautiously toward the house. There was no sign of life, just the eerie remnants of what used to be a home. I was about to turn back when I noticed something on the doorstep. There, sitting perfectly intact, was the meal I was supposed to deliver. I approached slowly, my heart pounding. The meal was still warm, untouched, and neatly placed, as if someone had just set it there. I looked around, but there was no one in sight. The silence was deafening, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Feeling incredibly uneasy, I decided to leave the meal on the doorstep and head back to my car. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I got back to the restaurant, I reported the strange incident to my manager, who looked at me like I was crazy. It was a chilly evening, and I was nearing the end of my delivery shift. My second to last stop was a house on the outskirts of town, a place I hadn't been to before. The neighborhood was quiet, almost eerily so. I parked my truck and walked up to the front door with the package. As I approached the house, I heard a faint, desperate cry of a baby coming from inside. My first instinct was concern. Maybe the parents needed help. I knocked on the door and waited, but there was no response. The crying continued, getting louder and more urgent. I knocked again, harder this time, and called out, "Hello? Is everything okay in there?" Still, no answer. The baby's cries were heart-wrenching, and I couldn't just leave without making sure everything was all right. I peered through the front windows, but the house seemed empty. There were no lights on, no movement inside, just the persistent sound of crying. Feeling a growing sense of unease, I decided to call the police. I explained the situation, and they assured me they would send someone to check it out. I waited by my truck, my eyes never leaving the house. The crying continued unabated, echoing in the still night air. When the police arrived, They approached the house cautiously. They knocked and called out, just as I had, but received no response. Eventually, they forced the door open and entered. I stood by, anxious to hear what they would find. After what felt like an eternity, one of the officers came back out, looking puzzled. "There's no one inside," he said. "The house is completely empty. No signs of recent habitation." I was stunned. "But what about the baby crying?" I asked. The officer shook his head. "We didn't hear anything when we were inside." "Are you sure you heard a baby crying?" I insisted that I had, but their expressions told me they thought I might be mistaken. They assured me they would keep an eye on the property, but there was nothing more they could do. It was close to midnight, and I was just about to clock out when my phone rang. The dispatcher told me there was a last-minute delivery that needed to be made to a secluded area on the outskirts of town. It was unusual for such a late hour, but overtime pay was good, so I agreed to take it. I punched the address into my GPS and headed out. The roads were dark and winding, with thick trees on either side, creating an almost tunnel-like effect. The further I drove, the more isolated it felt. There were no streetlights, no houses, just the endless stretch of road. I finally arrived at the address, a small clearing with nothing but an old, abandoned-looking cabin. The place was dark, and there was no sign of anyone waiting. I parked my truck, grabbed the package, and walked up to the front door. I knocked several times, but there was no answer. The only sound was the rustling of the wind through the trees. Feeling uneasy, I'd calling the contact number provided. To my frustration, the call wouldn't go through. The number was disconnected. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. The whole situation felt off. I decided to leave the package on the porch and get out of there as quickly as possible. As I turned to leave, I heard a faint whisper coming from the trees. It was so soft that I couldn't make out any words, but it sent a chill down my spine. I quickened my pace and practically ran back to my truck. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I jumped into the driver's seat, started the engine, and sped away. My heart was pounding, and I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that someone or something was watching me from the shadows. When I got back to the warehouse, I reported the incident to the dispatcher. They checked the order details and found that the contact number and address had been logged incorrectly. They assured me it was just a mix-up, but I knew there was more to it. The whispers, the disconnected number, the abandoned cabin, it all felt too real, too deliberate. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard those faint whispers echoing in my mind. To this day, I avoid late-night deliveries, especially to secluded areas. The memory of that night still haunts me, a chilling reminder that some calls are better left unanswered. It was just another day on my delivery route, or so I thought. I had a package for a house I'd never delivered to before, a quaint little place on the edge of town. When I arrived, the house looked normal enough, if not a bit old and worn. I walked up to the door and knocked. A woman answered, looking a bit frazzled, but polite. She thanked me and took the package. I couldn't help but notice her eyes widen slightly when she saw the return address, but she quickly composed herself and closed the door. As I walked back to my truck, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but I shrugged it off and continued with my deliveries. Later that night, I went home, had dinner, and went to bed, forgetting all about the strange delivery. The next morning, I stepped out to get my newspaper and nearly tripped over something on my doorstep. There, sitting on the mat, was the same old, creepy doll that had been in the package I delivered the day before. My heart skipped a beat. How did it get here? I never took it home. I picked up the doll, its porcelain face cracked and its glassy eyes staring blankly ahead. A chill ran down my spine. I looked around, but there was no one in sight. I took the doll inside, placed it on the table, and tried to think logically. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe the woman somehow tracked me down and left it here. But why? Feeling uneasy, I decided to take the doll back to the house. I drove back to the edge of town and knocked on the door. The same woman answered, and her face went pale when she saw the doll in my hands. "Why did you bring it back?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't," I replied. "It showed up on my doorstep this morning." She looked horrified. "This doll belonged to my grandmother. It's been in our family for generations. but it's cursed. Anyone who tries to get rid of it finds it back in their possession the next day. A wave of dread washed over me. I handed the doll to her, and she reluctantly took it. "Please, just take it back," I said. "I don't want anything to do with it." She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't mean for this to happen." I left the house, feeling a heavy weight lift off my shoulders. But that night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a faint tapping sound. I opened my front door, and there it was, the doll, sitting on my doorstep again. I tried everything to get rid of it. I threw it in the trash, buried it, even drove it out to the middle of nowhere and left it there. But every morning, it was back on my doorstep. The doll's presence became a terrifying constant in my life, and I couldn't escape it. Eventually, I had no choice but to accept it. The doll now sits in a glass case in my living room, a grim reminder of a delivery that went horribly wrong. And every night, as I try to sleep, I swear I can hear faint whispers, as if the doll is watching and waiting. The ice truck killer. My sister vanished one cold winter night, and our world shattered. She was vibrant and full of life, and her disappearance left us clinging to hope, but fearing the worst. Months dragged on without a trace. The police worked tirelessly, but it felt like we were chasing shadows. Then, one day, they called with news that changed everything. My sister's body had been found frozen, preserved, inside a refrigerated truck. The discovery was horrifying. The truck driver responsible had been using his vehicle to transport and preserve the bodies of his victims. He exploited the cold to delay decomposition, complicating the investigation and giving himself more time to evade capture. This man had been operating for years, targeting vulnerable women at truck stops and rest areas. He was a predator, using his seemingly ordinary job as a cover for his monstrous crimes. My sister was not his only victim. She was one of many, caught in his web of deceit and brutality. Learning the details was unbearable. My sister had been lured by his charm and apparent kindness, only to be met with unspeakable horror. The killer's method was cold and calculated. He would offer help or a ride, gaining his victims' trust before turning on them. He then used his refrigerated truck to transport their bodies across state lines, making it difficult for law enforcement to connect the dots. The day they arrested him was a bittersweet victory. Seeing him in handcuffs, facing justice, brought some relief, but it couldn't bring my sister back. The trial was a grueling process, filled with gruesome details that haunted me. The testimonies of other victims' families were heart-wrenching. We were united in our grief and anger, seeking justice for those we had lost. The killer showed no remorse, but the evidence was overwhelming. He was convicted on multiple counts of murder and sentenced to life without parole. It was a small comfort to know he would never hurt anyone again, but the pain of losing my sister remained. I was on a long-haul journey, driving through the night on an endless stretch of highway. The hum of the engine and the rhythmic thump of the tires created a hypnotic rhythm, lulling me into a trance-like state. Hours passed in a blur, and suddenly, I snapped back to reality. Jolted by the blaring horn of an oncoming truck, I swerved just in time, narrowly avoiding a collision. My heart pounded as I realized I had no memory of the last few hours or how I had traveled such a distance without being aware. Shaken, I pulled into a dimly lit rest stop to gather my thoughts. Checking my logbook, I confirmed that I had covered a remarkable distance in an impossibly short time. My watch showed hours missing, deepening the mystery. As I sat there, piecing together the events, another trucker approached. They noticed my pale complexion and shared a chilling tale of losing time on the same stretch of road. Apparently, this highway was notorious for causing bizarre episodes of lost time. Determined to unravel the mystery, I continued my journey, taking every precaution to stay alert. I blasted loud music, kept the windows open for fresh air, and took frequent breaks. Despite my efforts, an eerie sense of disorientation lingered, as if the road itself held a supernatural power. Later that night, strange lights appeared in my rearview mirror, darting and weaving. Panic set in as the lights vanished as quickly as they had appeared, leaving me questioning my own senses. When I finally reached my destination, the experience haunted me. The mystery of the lost time and the eerie lights remained unsolved, a reminder of the strange and unexplained phenomena lurking on the open road. Sharing my story with fellow drivers, I discovered I wasn't alone. Tales of that highway's eerie power continued to circulate, leaving us all to wonder what truly happens during those lost hours. My mother was the heart of our family, a beacon of warmth and kindness. When she disappeared one cold night, the dread that settled over us was unbearable. We searched everywhere, but as days turned into weeks, our hope began to fade. Then, the phone call came. The police had found her body in a desolate stretch of highway, concealed in a remote area off the interstate. She had been strangled, the life cruelly snatched away by a monster who used the anonymity of the roads to his advantage. The truck driver responsible was known as the Interstate Strangler. His method was horrifyingly systematic. He would lure women traveling alone with offers of help or a ride, then use his truck as a mobile killing chamber. The refrigerated compartments of his truck provided a chilling method to preserve his victims, complicating the investigation and giving him more time to evade capture. The police pieced together his pattern through painstaking work. He had been on the run for years, moving from state to state, his truck filled with hidden horrors. The sheer scale of his crimes was revealed only after he was finally caught, and the details of his spree were horrifying. During the trial, the courtroom was charged with tension. The prosecution laid out a chilling account of how he operated, detailing his method of targeting and killing his victims. Each revelation was more disturbing than the last, painting a grim picture of the terror he inflicted. When it was his turn to speak, his cold, indifferent demeanor was shocking. Asked about his actions, he responded, "I didn't do anything wrong. They trusted me, and that was their mistake. I did what I needed to survive." His lack of remorse was a slap in the face to the families who had been shattered by his actions. He was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to life without parole. The verdict was a small measure of justice, but it did little to mend the gaping wound left by his crimes. The trial was a harsh reminder of the evil that can lurk in the most unexpected places. I've been a long-haul truck driver for years, used to the solitude of the open road. One night, I was hauling a load through a desolate stretch of highway, miles from the nearest town. The only company I had was the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the CB radio. As midnight approached, a dense fog rolled in, reducing visibility to almost nothing. The road was eerily quiet, and an unsettling feeling crept over me. I tried to shake it off, focusing on the journey ahead. Suddenly, I saw a figure standing on the shoulder, barely visible in the fog. I slowed down, thinking it might be someone in need, but as I got closer, the figure vanished into thin air. Confused, I continued driving, trying to dismiss it as a trick of the light. A few miles later, I felt a strange chill inside the cab, as if the temperature had dropped. The radio flickered, static filling the silence. I glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. There, in the back seat, was a shadowy figure watching me. Heart pounding, I swerved, nearly losing control. When I looked again, the figure was gone. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. Was I overtired, or was something more sinister at play? I decided to pull over at the next truck stop to clear my head. As I parked, I noticed other truckers exchanging uneasy glances, whispering about strange happenings on the road. Inside the dimly lit diner, I overheard stories of a ghostly presence haunting the stretch of highway. Truckers spoke of a mysterious figure appearing in their rigs, vanishing without a trace. They called it the Phantom Hitchhiker. Some claimed it was the spirit of a trucker who had died in a crash years ago, doomed to wander the roads forever. Others said it was a warning, a sign to be careful on these treacherous paths. Despite the rational part of my mind dismissing these tales, I couldn't shake the feeling that something supernatural was happening. I returned to my truck, determined to finish my route and put the night behind me. As I drove on, the fog thickened, wrapping the world in a blanket of gray. My grip tightened on the wheel, and I kept glancing at the mirror, half expecting to see the figure return. Suddenly, the fog parted, revealing a sharp bend in the road. I slammed the brakes just in time, heart racing from the near miss as I steadied the truck. The radio crackled to life, a voice whispering my name. Terrified, I sped up, desperate to leave the haunted highway behind. The whispers grew louder, filling the cab with an unearthly presence. Just when I thought I couldn't take it any longer, the fog lifted, and the road opened up before me. When I finally reached my destination, I was exhausted, but relieved to be off that cursed road. The experience left me shaken, a reminder of the mysteries that lurk in the darkness. I still drive those long, lonely highways, but I'm always on guard, wary of the shadows that hide in the fog. Whether it was a ghost or a figment of my imagination, that night taught me to respect the unknown and to be cautious on the road less traveled. I was driving my truck down a dark, deserted highway, miles from the nearest town. The night was quiet, with only the hum of the engine breaking the silence. The road stretched on, flanked by dense forests on either side. It was the kind of night where even the stars seemed to hide, leaving the world cloaked in an unsettling darkness. Suddenly, in my rearview mirror, I noticed strange lights trailing behind me. At first, I thought it was another vehicle, but the lights didn't behave normally. They hovered, darted, and weaved in erratic patterns. My heart began to race as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Were my eyes playing tricks on me? Determined to understand, I pulled over to the side of the road. The lights vanished, leaving me alone in the oppressive darkness. I stepped out, the cold night air prickling my skin. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant rustling of leaves. I scanned the horizon, but saw nothing unusual. The eerie stillness was unsettling, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Back on the road, the lights reappeared, dancing in the sky like ghostly fireflies. Panic set in, but curiosity drove me to continue. I remembered hearing stories from other truckers about phantom lights along this stretch of highway, tales I had dismissed as exaggerations. Now, faced with the inexplicable, those stories seemed all too real. As I approached a sharp curve, the lights suddenly shot upward, disappearing into the night sky. I felt a chill run down my spine. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, knuckles white with tension. I was left questioning everything I knew about this road and the unseen forces at play. When I reached the next truck stop, I shared my experience with fellow drivers. Many nodded knowingly, recounting similar encounters. Some believed it was a natural phenomenon, while others whispered of UFOs, and theories abounded, each more unsettling than the last. It was a foggy night in Elmore, Ohio, and I was driving home from a late shift at work. The mist was so thick that it felt like it was pressing in on me from all sides, and the headlights barely cut through the gloom. As I drove down a particularly deserted stretch of road, I saw a figure ahead. At first, I thought it was just another biker out for a late-night ride, but as I got closer, I realized something was terribly wrong. The figure appeared to be a motorcyclist, but there was no head, just a helmet-less neck where his head should have been. I could hardly believe my eyes. I slowed down, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The headless motorcyclist seemed to be moving slowly, almost as if he was searching for something. I felt a chill run down my spine as I watched him ride through the fog, his bike cutting through the mist with an eerie silence. I stopped my car, unsure of what to do. I knew the legend of the headless motorcyclist of Elmore, a ghostly rider said to haunt the roads, searching endlessly for his lost head. The stories claimed that he appeared on foggy nights like this one, and then vanished back into the mist. As I watched, the headless figure seemed to dissolve into the fog, his motorcycle disappearing as if swallowed by the night. I was left sitting there, shaken and bewildered. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but the sight of that headless rider was all too real. When I got home, I looked up the local legend and found out that I wasn't alone. Many people had reported seeing the same spectral motorcyclist, always under similar conditions on foggy nights when the mist made everything look otherworldly. To this day, that night remains one of the most unnerving experiences I've ever had. The foggy roads of Elmore hold more than just shadows. They carry the haunting presence of a rider forever searching for something he can never find. It was a cool spring evening when I first heard about the ghost on Archer Road in Illinois. I'd heard the stories about a young woman in a prom dress who supposedly appeared to drivers, asking for a ride and then disappearing when they reached her destination. Naturally, I was skeptical, but curiosity got the better of me. One night, I decided to take a drive down Archer Road just to see if there was any truth to the tale. The road was quiet, and the moonlight cast eerie shadows through the trees. I had just started to think the stories were just that, stories, when I saw her. She was standing by the side of the road, wearing a beautiful but tattered prom dress. Her appearance was so out of place that I slowed down to make sure she was okay. As I pulled up beside her, she looked at me with a sad expression and asked if I could give her a ride home. She provided an address that wasn't too far off, so I agreed. We chatted a bit during the drive. She seemed polite but distant, and there was something otherworldly about her. As we approached the address she had given me, I noticed she was getting more and more quiet. When we arrived, she thanked me and started to get out of the car. Just as I was about to ask if she needed any further assistance, she vanished. It was like she was there one moment and gone the next. I sat there stunned, trying to process what had just happened. I got out of the car and checked around, but there was no sign of her anywhere. The house she had given me was dark and appeared empty. When I got home, I did some research and found out that the story of the ghostly prom dress wearing woman on Archer Road was well known in the area. Many others had reported similar experiences, with the woman asking for a ride and disappearing when they reached her destination. That night remains etched in my memory, a chilling reminder that sometimes the legends we hear might have a kernel of truth, and Archer Road is a place where those tales come to life. I'll never forget my drive down Bluebell Hill on that foggy evening. It was one of those nights where the mist seemed to cling to everything, making it hard to see very far ahead. I was just trying to get home after a long day when I saw something that made my blood run cold. As I rounded a bend, I saw a figure standing in the middle of the road. At first, I thought it might be a person in trouble, but as I got closer, I realized it was a woman in a flowing white dress. She looked like a bride, but there was something eerie about her appearance, almost ethereal. Instinctively, I swerved to avoid hitting her, and my heart was pounding in my chest. I glanced in my rearview mirror, expecting to see her standing there, but she was gone. I pulled over to the side of the road, trying to catch my breath and figure out what I had just seen. I got out of my car and looked around, but there was no sign of the woman. The road was completely empty, and the fog was rolling in thicker than ever. I searched the area for a while, but she was nowhere to be found. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Later, when I shared my experience with friends, they told me about the legend of the ghostly bride of Bluebell Hill. Apparently, many drivers have had similar encounters with the spectral bride who appears in the road, only to disappear when they stop to check. The story goes that she is a spirit of a bride who tragically died on that very road, and she now wanders there, forever trying to get to her wedding. Even now, whenever I drive down that stretch of road, I can't help but feel a chill, wondering if I might encounter the ghostly bride once again. I still remember the fear that gripped our small town back in the 1980s. It was a time when hitchhiking was common, and people didn't think twice about getting into a stranger's car. But then, the redhead murders began, and everything changed. It all started when the body of a young woman with red hair was found along a highway. At first, people thought it was an isolated incident, a tragic but random act of violence. But then another body was found, and then another. All young women, all with red or auburn hair, all abandoned along highways in different states. It was as if the killer was using the highways as their hunting ground, picking up hitchhikers or women in vulnerable situations, and then discarding their bodies like trash. The pattern was chilling, and the media soon dubbed the unknown perpetrator the redhead killer. Law enforcement from multiple states tried to piece together the puzzle. They interviewed witnesses, followed leads, and compared notes, but the killer was always one step ahead. It was like trying to catch a ghost. Some believed the murderer was a truck driver, using their job as a cover to travel across the country and commit these heinous acts without raising suspicion. For the families of the victims, the pain was unbearable. Their daughters, sisters, and mothers were gone, and they had no answers. No justice. Every new body found along a highway only deepened the sense of dread. It could happen anywhere, to anyone. As time passed, the frequency of the murders seemed to decrease, but the fear never fully went away. Even now, decades later, people still talk about the redhead murders with a sense of unease. The case remains unsolved, a dark chapter in our history that serves as a grim reminder of the dangers that once lurked along our highways. So, if you ever find yourself traveling those lonely stretches of road, remember the stories of those young women. Be cautious, be aware, and never forget that the redhead killer was never caught. I still get chills when I think back to the fall of 2002. It was a terrifying time to be living around the Washington, D.C. area. I remember the constant fear that gripped the community, a fear that came from not knowing where or when the next attack would occur. This was the time of the Beltway snipers. It started in October, and the randomness of the attacks made it even more horrifying. The snipers, later identified as John Allen Muhammad and Lee Boyd Malvo, would shoot their victims from a distance with a high-powered rifle, usually while the victims were doing everyday activities like pumping gas, shopping, or mowing the lawn. They turned the most mundane tasks into potential death traps. I remember vividly how everyone in the area was on edge. You couldn't go about your day without constantly looking over your shoulder. Gas stations put up tarps around their pumps to provide some semblance of cover, and people would crouch behind their cars while fueling up, hoping to avoid being an easy target. Schools went into lockdown mode, and outdoor activities were canceled. It felt like we were living in a war zone. The scariest part was the complete lack of a pattern in the locations and victims. The snipers would shoot someone in one county, and then strike miles away the next day. They even left cryptic notes at some of the crime scenes, demanding money and making threats, which only added to the chaos and fear. The media was all over it, and every day brought news of another attack, another victim. I remember the collective sigh of relief we all breathed when the snipers were finally caught at a rest stop in Maryland. It turned out that Muhammad, a former Army marksman, had converted the trunk of his Chevrolet Caprice into a mobile sniper's nest, with a small hole cut out to fire from. In total, they killed 10 people and critically injured 3 others. The motive behind the shootings was convoluted, involving personal vendettas and a plan to extort money from the government. Muhammad was sentenced to death and executed in 2009, while Malvo, being a minor at the time of the killings, received life sentences without parole. Those few weeks in 2002 left an indelible mark on all of us who lived through it. The Beltway snipers turned our daily routines into nightmares, and the terror they inflicted is something I'll never forget. Even now, over 2 decades later, I still find myself getting uneasy when I'm out and about, a reminder of the days when a trip to the gas station could have been my last. I'll never forget that night I drove down Route 491. It was a stretch of road that had a reputation for being a little eerie, especially since it used to be known as Route 666. It was late, and the darkness seemed to stretch on forever, with only my headlights cutting through the night. As I drove, I noticed a pair of headlights behind me, coming up fast. I thought it was just another car trying to overtake, but the headlights were growing closer at an alarming rate. I glanced at my speedometer and saw I was already going well over the limit. Still, the car behind me was gaining ground rapidly. I could see the outline of a black sedan, and it looked like it was trying to intimidate me with its high beams and closed tailgating. My heart was racing as I tried to speed up, but no matter how fast I went, the phantom car stayed right on my bumper. It felt like a high-stakes chase, with the sedan closing in on me relentlessly. Just when I thought I couldn't handle the pressure any longer, the sedan seemed to abruptly disappear. I looked in my rearview mirror, and it was like it had vanished into thin air. The road behind me was empty. I pulled over to the side, my hands trembling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I later learned that others had similar experiences on Route 491, and many believe it's haunted by a phantom vehicle. Some say it's the spirit of a driver who met a tragic end on the road and now roams, chasing down those who dare to drive through. Even now, when I think back to that night, it sends shivers down my spine. Route 491 is known for its ghost stories, And my encounter with the phantom car was a reminder that some legends might be rooted in something more real than we'd like to believe. It was a crisp autumn evening when I decided to take a drive down Seven Sisters Road in Nebraska. I'd heard the stories about it being haunted, but I never really believed in ghosts. Still, something about the legend intrigued me, so I figured I'd see for myself. The road was narrow and surrounded by dense woods, and the evening light was fading fast. As I drove, I noticed how quiet it was, eerily quiet. It was almost as if the world had stopped making noise. Then, out of nowhere, I saw them, a group of 7 children, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, standing by the side of the road. They looked like they were waiting for something, their faces pale and expressionless. I slowed down, my curiosity getting the better of me. The kids didn't move, they just stared ahead. Feeling uneasy but concerned, I stopped my car and rolled down the window to ask if they needed help. As I did, the children started to slowly walk towards the car. That's when I noticed something unsettling. Their feet were barely touching the ground. It was like they were gliding rather than walking. Before I could react, the kids vanished into the woods, disappearing as suddenly as they had appeared. I got out of the car and looked around, but there was no sign of them. The forest was dark and silent, with no trace of the children or any indication of where they might have gone. That night left me with a chill that hasn't gone away. Seeing those ghostly figures in the middle of nowhere made me question everything I thought I knew about the supernatural. Seven Sisters Road had proven to be more than just a spooky tale. It was a place where the past and present seemed to collide in the most unsettling ways. It was a clear, calm night when I decided to take a drive down Riverdale Road in Colorado. I had heard rumors about it being haunted, but I wasn't sure if I believed them. Still, I was curious to see if there was any truth to the tales. The road was isolated, with only a few streetlights casting dim circles of light on the pavement. As I drove, the eerie stillness of the area began to set a tense mood. The trees lining the road seemed to close in, creating a tunnel of shadows. Then, things started to get strange. I noticed a shadowy figure running alongside my car. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light or my imagination, but the figure was clear, a spectral jogger who seemed to keep pace with me no matter how fast I drove. Feeling a mix of fear and fascination, I slowed down to get a better look. The figure was a man in old-fashioned running gear, his form transparent and flickering as if he was struggling to remain visible. I could see through him, and he appeared to be running in place, as though trapped in a loop. I decided to pull over and investigate. As I stepped out of my car, the figure stopped and looked directly at me with an expression of sadness and longing. Before I could react, he faded away into the darkness of the trees. I looked around but found no trace of him or any sign of where he might have gone. Back home, I learned more about the legend of Riverdale Road. The story spoke of a ghostly jogger who had died in a tragic accident while running along that road. Now, he's said to run alongside unsuspecting drivers, forever trapped in his final moments. That night on Riverdale Road left me with a profound sense of unease. It was as if I had glimpsed a piece of the past that refused to fade away. The haunted jogger had shown me that some roads hold more than just memories, they hold echoes of lost souls, forever bound to their tragic fates. It was the winter of 2019, and I was working late in downtown New York City. After a long day at the office, I missed my usual subway line and had to catch a less frequented train on an older route. I was exhausted and just wanted to get home, so I didn't pay much attention to the new route I was on. Around midnight, I found myself at a nearly deserted subway station that seemed unusually quiet. The flickering fluorescent lights cast long, eerie shadows on the walls. As I waited for my train, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The usual clamor of the subway system was replaced by an unsettling silence, broken only by the occasional, distant clanking of metal. When the train finally arrived, it was unlike any I had seen before. It was an old-fashioned, vintage train, its design reminiscent of something from the early 1900s. The paint was chipped, and the windows were grimy and opaque, adding to its otherworldly appearance. The train pulled into the station with an almost ghostly hiss, and the doors creaked open. I hesitated for a moment, feeling an inexplicable sense of dread. The interior of the train was dimly lit, and the seats were covered in a thick layer of dust. The air was musty, and there was an odd, metallic scent that lingered. Despite my apprehension, I boarded the train, hoping it would get me home quickly. As the train started moving, the lights flickered and the atmosphere grew colder. The rhythmic clacking of the wheels on the tracks was accompanied by a faint, haunting melody playing over the speakers, something that sounded like a distorted lullaby. I was the only passenger, which only heightened my sense of unease. The train rumbled through the dark tunnels, and I noticed the scenery outside the windows was strange and endless, black void punctuated by flickering lights that seemed to be growing dimmer. Panic started to set in, but I couldn't get off. The doors of the train were inexplicably stuck, and no matter how hard I tried, they wouldn't open. Suddenly, I heard whispering voices coming from the shadows, as if the train itself was alive. The whispers grew louder, and I began to see vague, shadowy figures moving through the train, their forms barely discernible. They seemed to be watching me, their eyes glowing with an eerie light. The train jolted to a stop in a tunnel that was darker than anything I had seen before. The whispers turned into eerie wails, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The shadowy figures drew closer, their shapes becoming more defined and menacing. The temperature inside the train plummeted, and I could see my breath forming visible puffs of fog. In a panic, I smashed the emergency door release. The doors finally opened, and I bolted out onto the tracks, running through the pitch-black tunnel. I could hear the train's haunting melody, and the wails of the shadowy figures fading behind me as I stumbled into the next station. When I finally emerged into the safety of a brightly lit station, I looked back at the tunnel entrance. It was as if the cursed train had vanished into thin air, leaving nothing but the eerie silence of the subway behind. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. I later learned that the route I was on had been closed for decades after a series of mysterious disappearances and accidents. Locals spoke of a cursed train that appeared to those who wandered into its path, a reminder of the dark past that the subway system tried to forget. It was the summer of 2018 when my friends and I decided to explore Aokigahara, the infamous suicide forest in Japan. We had heard countless stories about the forest's dark history and eerie atmosphere, and being avid adventurers, we couldn't resist the allure of experiencing it for ourselves. We arrived at the forest in the late afternoon, the sun beginning its descent, casting long shadows through the dense canopy. The forest was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves underfoot. As we ventured deeper, the trees seemed to close in around us, creating an almost claustrophobic feeling. After walking for about an hour, we stumbled upon an old, abandoned railway line cutting through the forest. The tracks were rusty and overgrown with vegetation, giving the impression they hadn't been used in decades. Curiosity piqued, we decided to follow the tracks, wondering where they might lead. As dusk fell, an unsettling feeling began to creep over us. The air grew colder, and an unnatural silence enveloped the forest. We joked nervously to break the tension, but our laughter sounded hollow and out of place in the oppressive gloom. Suddenly, we heard a distant, echoing whistle. We all stopped in our tracks, exchanging uneasy glances. There was no way a train could be operating on these abandoned tracks. The whistle grew louder, and soon we could feel the ground vibrating beneath our feet. In the dim light, a ghostly glow appeared down the track, growing brighter with each passing moment. We stood there, rooted to the spot, as the spectral train emerged from the darkness. It was an old steam locomotive, its headlights flickering like lanterns in the night. As the train drew closer, we could see figures inside shadowy, indistinct shapes that seemed to watch us with hollow, mournful eyes. The train was almost transparent, a wraith-like apparition made of mist and shadows. The sound of the engine was deafening, yet it felt surreal, like something out of a nightmare. The train passed by us slowly, its ghostly passengers staring at us as if trying to communicate something. The air grew colder, and an oppressive weight pressed down on us, making it hard to breathe. The sensation of icy fingers brushing against my skin sent chills down my spine. Just as suddenly as it had appeared, the train faded into the darkness, leaving behind an eerie silence. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, trying to process what we had just witnessed. My heart was pounding, and I could see the fear mirrored in my friends' faces. We quickly decided to head back. Our adventure in Aokigahara cut short by the terrifying encounter. The walk back to our car was tense and silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts. When we finally reached the edge of the forest, we breathed a collective sigh of relief. Later, we learned that the abandoned railway line had once been used to transport goods and workers, but had been closed down after a series of tragic accidents. Some say the spirits of those who died still haunt the tracks, forever bound to their tragic fate. In the fall of 2017, I had just moved to London for a new job and was eager to explore the city's rich history. One evening, after a long day, I decided to take the London Underground home. It was late, and the station was nearly deserted, casting an eerie shadow over the usually bustling place. As I waited for my train, I noticed an old, disused platform across the tracks. It was shrouded in darkness and grime, clearly abandoned for years. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to get a closer look. As I stepped closer, the air grew colder, and I could see my breath in the dim light. Then, I heard a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the direction of the old platform. My heart pounded as I strained to see through the darkness. The tapping grew louder, accompanied by a distant, haunting whistle that sent shivers down my spine. A ghostly light appeared in the tunnel, growing brighter with each passing second. I stood frozen, mesmerized and terrified, as a spectral train emerged from the darkness. It was an old steam locomotive, its lights flickering like dying embers. The train was almost transparent, a wraith-like apparition made of mist and shadows. The train slowed to a stop at the abandoned platform. Shadowy figures moved inside, their faces obscured, but their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. They stared at me with a mournful intensity, as if pleading for help or seeking something they had lost. The air grew colder, and an oppressive pressure made it hard to breathe. The ghostly train's doors creaked open, and I felt a powerful, almost magnetic pull to step inside. Just as I was about to take a step forward, I heard a loud clatter behind me. I spun around to see a station worker, his face pale and eyes wide with shock. "Are you all right?" he asked urgently. The spectral train and its eerie passengers vanished into the darkness, as if they had never been there. The station returned to its normal, lifeless state. My heart raced as the worker guided me to the next arriving train. I was too shaken to speak, and as I boarded, I glanced back at the old platform, now empty and silent. When I got home, I was desperate to understand what I had seen. I dug into the history of that platform and discovered something disturbing. Years ago, there was indeed a tragic accident involving a train that had derailed on that very platform, resulting in numerous fatalities. Witnesses had reported seeing ghostly figures in the aftermath, but those accounts had been dismissed as mere folklore. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that the spectral train was not just a random apparition, but a manifestation of the souls lost in the accident, trapped in a never-ending loop of their final moments. The chilling realization that I had seen the remnants of such a tragedy made my blood run cold. It was the summer of 2019, when I decided to take a trip along the overland route in Australia with my son, Jake. I'd always been fascinated by trains and the eerie tales of ghostly encounters, and I thought it would be a fun adventure for the two of us. Little did I know, we were about to have an experience that would haunt us forever. We boarded the train in Melbourne, excited for the journey ahead. The scenery was breathtaking, but as night fell, an unsettling feeling crept over me. I couldn't shake the sense that something was watching us, lurking just out of sight. Jake, always the curious and brave one, seemed unfazed and eager to explore the train. After dinner, Jake and I wandered to the back of the train, hoping to take some photos of the night sky. The corridor was dimly lit, casting long, flickering shadows. As we walked, we heard a faint, rhythmic tapping like someone walking with a cane. Jake, intrigued, tugged at my sleeve and urged me to follow the sound. The tapping led us to an old storage compartment that was supposed to be locked. To our surprise, the door creaked open at Jake's touch. Inside, it was pitch dark, but the tapping continued, now accompanied by a soft, almost melancholic whistling. The tapping led us to an old storage compartment that was supposed to be locked. To our surprise, the door creaked open at Jake's touch. Inside, It was pitch dark, but the tapping continued, now accompanied by a soft, almost melancholic whistling. The tapping led us to an old storage compartment that was supposed to be locked. To our surprise, the door creaked open at Jake's touch. Inside, it was pitch dark, but the tapping continued, now accompanied by a soft, almost melancholic whistling. My heart pounded as we stepped inside, the air growing colder with each step. I could barely see, but then I spotted him, a shadowy figure standing at the far end of the compartment. He wore an old-fashioned engineer's uniform, and in his hand, he held a lantern that flickered with an otherworldly glow. "Hello," called out, my voice trembling. The figure turned slowly, revealing a face that was both sorrowful and stern. His eyes seemed to pierce through me, filled with a sadness I couldn't comprehend. He lifted a gloved hand and pointed towards the end of the train, where the engine was. Suddenly, I was overwhelmed by a flood of images, flashes of a tragic accident, an engineer losing control of the train, the screams of passengers, and finally, a fiery crash. The pain and despair were almost too much to bear. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. Jake, clutching my hand tightly, whispered, "Dad, what's happening?" His voice was shaky, filled with fear and confusion. When I looked up again, the figure was gone. The compartment was empty, save for the lingering cold. I pulled Jake close, and we rushed back to our seats, our hearts racing. I tried to explain what I'd seen to the other passengers, but they just laughed it off, attributing it to an overactive imagination. The rest of the journey passed in a blur. I couldn't shake the vision of the ghostly engineer and the tragedy he'd endured. When we finally arrived at our destination, I spoke to a conductor about what we'd experienced. He listened intently, then nodded solemnly. "You've seen him, then," he said quietly. "The ghost of the engineer who died in the Great Overland Crash of 1912. They say his spirit still rides the rails, searching for peace." Jake and I will never forget that night. The haunted look in the engineer's eyes still lingers in my mind. The overland route is beautiful, but if you ever find yourself on that train at night, be wary. Some spirits never leave, forever bound to the tragedy that took them. And remember, you might not be alone in your journey. Someone from the past might be watching, waiting for their story to be told. In the winter of 2020, my friends and I set out on an adventure into the Paris catacombs. We had always been fascinated by the macabre and the catacombs, with their labyrinthine passages of bones and history, seemed like the perfect place for a thrilling exploration. We entered through a concealed entrance we had discovered online, descending into the depths beneath Paris. The catacombs were exactly as expected, an eerie maze of skeletal remains and damp, echoing tunnels. We wandered deeper, marveling at the historical artifacts and the eerie ambience. After several hours of wandering, we stumbled upon an old, abandoned railway tunnel that seemed oddly out of place. The walls were coated in dust and spiderwebs, and the tracks were rusted and forgotten. Intrigued, we decided to follow this tunnel, thinking it might lead us to some hidden corner of the catacombs. As we ventured further, the temperature dropped suddenly, and an unsettling vibration seemed to run through the ground. We joked nervously to mask our unease, but the clacking sound grew louder, rhythmic, and haunting, as though something or someone was moving along the tracks. Our breath caught when we saw it, a ghostly light emerging from the darkness ahead. We froze, our eyes widening in disbelief, as a spectral train materialized before us. It was an old steam locomotive, its once bright headlights now flickering weakly in the darkness, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The ghostly train seemed to glide silently over the rusted tracks. The rhythmic clacking of the wheels was hypnotic, but it felt wrong, unnatural. Inside the train, shadowy figures shifted restlessly, their faces obscured, but their eyes glowing with a haunting, sorrowful light. It was as if they were trapped in a nightmarish loop, forever bound to this spectral journey. The train drew closer, and we could feel the cold seeping through our clothes, a bone-deep chill that seemed to penetrate everything. An oppressive silence hung in the air, broken only by the mournful whistle of the phantom locomotive. The train's presence was overwhelming, and the figures inside watched us with an intense, almost pleading gaze. Just as the train came to a stop directly in front of us, the air became stiflingly cold, and the pressure seemed to bear down on us. My friends and I exchanged terrified glances, unable to move. The ghostly figures stared at us, their eyes reflecting the tragic stories of those who had perished. Suddenly, the train's doors creaked open with a ghostly wail. We could feel an icy draft sweeping through the tunnel, and the shadowy figures began to reach out, their hands stretching toward us. Panic surged through us, and we instinctively turned to flee. As we ran, the ghostly train began to fade, its light dimming and its mournful whistle growing fainter. We raced through the catacombs, the echo of our footsteps mingling with the fading clacking of the phantom train. When we finally emerged back into the surface world, we were breathless and shaken, our minds reeling from the encounter. Later, we learned that the abandoned railway tunnel had once been part of a system used to transport limestone. Decades ago, a catastrophic accident had claimed the lives of several workers, and it was said that the spirits of those who died had never left. The spectral train was a manifestation of that dark history, forever trapped in the catacombs. You know, I've driven down countless roads in my life, but nothing prepared me for what happened that night. It was late, probably around midnight, and I was driving through a rural area I wasn't familiar with. The road was narrow, surrounded by dense trees, and there wasn't a single street light to be seen. Just me, my car, and the darkness. I was low on gas, but figured I could make it to the next town. Of course, luck wasn't on my side. My car sputtered and finally died, right there in the middle of nowhere. The dashboard lights dimmed, leaving me in total darkness. I cursed under my breath, realizing I'd have to walk to find help. I grabbed my phone for light and started walking, hoping to find a gas station or at least a house where I could call for help. The road stretched on endlessly, and after what felt like miles, I finally spotted a small convenience store in the distance. It looked run down, but the lights were on, and that was all that mattered. I explained my situation to the old man behind the counter, who seemed a bit too eager to help. He handed me a gas can and wished me luck. I hurried back down the road, my breath fogging up in the cold night air. But when I got back to where I thought I'd left my car, there was nothing. No car, no sign of anything. Just an empty stretch of road. I stood there, dumbfounded. I was certain this was the spot, but my car was gone. I started walking further up the road, thinking maybe I'd misjudged the distance in the dark. But the road seemed different now. The trees, the bends, it all felt unfamiliar, as if I'd taken a wrong turn without realizing it. Panic began to set in as I realized I was completely alone, with no car, no road markers, and no idea where I was. I decided to retrace my steps to the convenience store, but the more I walked, the more disoriented I became. The road seemed to twist and turn in ways that didn't make sense. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw the faint glow of the store's sign in the distance. But when I reached the spot where the store should have been, there was nothing. Just an overgrown lot, as if the place had been abandoned for years. I was completely shaken. How could a whole store just disappear? I eventually made it to the main road and flagged down a passing car. The driver looked at me like I was crazy when I told him what happened, but he was kind enough to drive me to the nearest town. When I asked around about the convenience store, the locals told me it had burned down years ago, long before I could have possibly seen it. To this day, I can't explain what happened. My car was never found, and I still get chills thinking about that night. It was as if I'd stepped into another world for a brief moment, and when I came back, nothing was the same. You ever have one of those nights where everything just feels off? That's exactly what happened to me a couple of years ago, and to this day, can't shake the memory. I was driving home from a friend's house, and it was already late around AM. The road was completely deserted, just a long stretch of asphalt cutting through a forested area. I had this uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach, but I chalked it up to being tired. Then, out of nowhere, my gas gauge suddenly dropped to empty. I mean, it was fine just minutes before. I cursed my luck as the car sputtered to a stop on the side of the road. There I was, stranded in the middle of nowhere, and my phone barely had a signal. I managed to get a text out to my friend, telling him what happened and asking if he could bring me some gas. He said he'd be there in about 30 minutes, so I just had to wait. That's when things got weird. At first, It was just a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned to look, but there was nothing there, just the trees swaying in the breeze. But then it happened again. And this time, I was sure I saw something. A shadow, darting across the road behind my car. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. After all, it was late, and I was alone in the dark. But the shadows kept moving, darting back and forth, getting closer to the car. I couldn't see anything making those shadows, no people, no animals, nothing. Just these dark, formless shapes creeping along the ground, sliding across the road, and circling the car like they were alive. I locked the doors and turned on the interior light, trying to calm myself down. But the shadows didn't stop. They seemed to be gathering around me, growing bolder, almost like they were curious about me, or worse, like they were hunting. I started to panic, my heart pounding in my chest. I kept checking the time, hoping my friend would show up soon. The minutes dragged by, and the shadows just kept moving, never taking shape, just shifting and swirling in the darkness. Then, finally, I saw headlights in the distance. My friend was coming. The moment those lights washed over the car, the shadows vanished. Just like that, they were gone, as if they'd never been there in the first place. When my friend pulled up, I practically jumped out of the car, shaking like a leaf. He asked what was wrong, but I couldn't even begin to explain what I'd just experienced. I just told him I needed to get out of there. We filled up the tank, and I got the hell out of that place as fast as I could. To this day, I have no idea what those shadows were, and I don't think I ever want to find out. All I know is that something was out there with me that night, and it wasn't just my imagination. I was driving through a rural area, way off the beaten path. It was one of those nights where the sky was pitch black, and the only light came from my headlights cutting through the dark. I hadn't seen another car for miles, just endless fields and the occasional farmhouse in the distance. As luck would have it, my gas gauge suddenly dropped to empty. I was miles from the nearest town, so I had no choice but to pull over and hope for the best. I turned off the engine and tried to calm myself down, thinking about who I could call for help. That's when I saw something movement in the field to my right. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer, but as I squinted into the darkness, I realized it was a child, a little boy, no older than 6 or 7, walking towards my car. His clothes were old-fashioned, like something out of a photo from the early 1900s. He came up to my window, his face pale and eyes wide with fear. "Mister," he said, his voice trembling, "can you help me? I'm lost." My heart sank. What was a kid doing out here alone in the middle of the night? I couldn't just leave him there. I got out of the car and crouched down to his level, trying to reassure him. "Hey, it's okay. Where are your parents? Do you know where you live?" He shook his head, tears welling up in his eyes. "I can't find my way home," he whispered. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I forced a smile and told him we'd figure it out together. I reached out to take his hand, but the moment I did, he was gone. Just like that, he vanished into thin air, right in front of me. One second, he was there, and the next, I was standing alone by my car, my hand grasping at nothing but empty air. I stumbled back, my mind racing to make sense of what just happened. There was no trace of him, no footprints, no rustling in the nearby fields, nothing. It was like he had never been there at all. I scrambled back into my car, locking the doors and trying to catch my breath. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I didn't know what I had just seen, but I knew I had to get out of there. Miraculously, the engine sputtered to life when I turned the key. Despite the empty gas tank, I didn't question it. I floored it, speeding away from that place as fast as I could, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. When I finally reached the next town, I asked around about any missing children, but no one knew anything. There hadn't been a child reported missing in that area for decades. The locals, however, weren't surprised when I described the boy. They told me stories of a child who had gone missing nearly a century ago, wandering off from his home and never found. Some say his spirit still roams those fields, looking for someone to help him find his way home. And I guess, on that night, he thought I could be the one. You ever have one of those encounters that just sticks with you, like a shadow that follows you around, no matter how hard you try to shake it. This is one of those stories, and I still get chills every time I think about it. It was late, probably around PM, and I was driving through a remote part of the countryside. The kind of place where the roads twist and turn without a single streetlight to guide you. I was low on gas, but convinced I could make it to the next town. As you can probably guess, I was wrong. My car started sputtering, and before I knew it, I was rolling to a stop on the side of the road, surrounded by nothing but darkness and the distant outline of trees. I tried restarting the engine a few times, but it was no use. I was out of gas, and my phone was barely holding onto a signal. I decided to get out and look around, hoping maybe I could spot a house or something nearby. That's when I saw him, an old man, standing a little ways down the road. I hadn't noticed him before, and it was odd because there hadn't been any cars passing by, and I was sure I was the only one out there. He was tall, with a weathered face, and wore old clothes that looked like they belonged in a different era. He was just standing there, staring at me, and I'll be honest, it freaked me out a bit. I waved at him, trying to keep my voice steady as I called out, "Hey there, car ran out of gas. Do you know if there's a gas station nearby?" The old man didn't move for what felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, he started walking toward me, his eyes never leaving mine. When he got close enough, I noticed his face was etched with lines of worry, his expression almost desperate. "You need to leave," he said in a voice that was firm, but laced with fear. "Get out of here right now. Don't stay here any longer than you have to." I was taken aback. "What do you mean?" "I'm just waiting for a friend to bring me some gas." He shook his head, looking around as if expecting something or someone to show up any second. "This place isn't safe. People go missing around here. They're here one moment, and the next, they're just gone. Don't wait. Leave." I didn't know what to think. Part of me wanted to brush him off as just some eccentric old guy, but the urgency in his voice made me uneasy. I thanked him and watched as he turned and walked back down the road, disappearing into the darkness. My friend finally arrived with a gas can about 20 minutes later. I was anxious to leave, so we filled up the tank quickly, and I mentioned the old man's warning. My friend's face went pale. He'd grown up in the area and told me that stretch of road was notorious for strange disappearances. Over the years, several people had gone missing without a trace, and their vehicles were often found abandoned, much like mine had been. He told me that locals believe something evil lurks in those woods, something that takes people. The old man's warning echoed in my head, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I just narrowly escaped something terrible. As we drove away, I glanced back in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the old man standing there again. But there was nothing, just the darkness swallowing up the road behind us. I never drove down that road again, and every time I hear about someone going missing in the area, I think about that old man and the warning he gave me. Maybe he saved my life that night, or maybe he was something else entirely. All I know is, I listened, and I got out of there while I still could. Let me tell you about the night I stopped trusting time. It was supposed to be a simple drive, just a few hours to clear my head after a long day. I wasn't even worried when I noticed my gas gauge dipping toward empty. I figured I'd stop at the next station and fill up. But then, the needle dropped faster than I expected, and before I knew it, my car was sputtering to a stop on a deserted stretch of highway. I pulled over, cursing my luck, and checked my phone. No signal. Typical. It was the middle of nowhere, no lights, no houses, just an endless road surrounded by trees that seemed to close in around me. I wasn't scared, not yet anyway. I'd dealt with worse situations. I figured I'd wait a bit, maybe someone would pass by, or the signal would come back, and I could call for help. I checked my watch, 1:15 a.m. Ideal, but I'd get through it. I leaned back in my seat, trying to get comfortable, and watched the minutes tick by. 1:20, 1:30, still no cars, no lights on the horizon. The night was dead silent, the kind of silence that presses in on you, making you hyper-aware of every little noise your own body makes. I must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing I knew, I was jerking awake, heart pounding like I'd just had a nightmare I couldn't remember. My first thought was to check the time too. 4:45 a.m. Only an hour and a half had passed, but something felt off. The air was thick, heavy, like a storm was brewing, but the sky was clear. I sat there, trying to shake off the strange feeling creeping over me. My phone was still dead. No signal, and the road was as empty as before. I couldn't remember falling asleep, and worse, I couldn't shake the sense that I'd been somewhere else, somewhere I couldn't quite recall. Suddenly, headlights appeared in the distance, cutting through the darkness. Relief washed over me as a car pulled up behind mine. A guy stepped out, looking concerned. He offered me a ride to the nearest gas station, and I jumped at the chance to get out of there. As we drove, I noticed the sky starting to lighten. Dawn was breaking. I glanced at my watch again, confused. It read 2:50 a.m. Oh wait, the sun was rising, but according to my watch, only 5 minutes had passed since I last checked. I asked the guy what time it was, and he said it was nearly a.m. My heart skipped a beat. How could that be? I checked my watch again, but it still showed the same time. The guy must have noticed the panic on my face, because he asked if I was alright. I just nodded, too freaked out to say anything. I couldn't remember the last few hours. Yet here I was, watching the sunrise like I'd lost a chunk of time. When we got to the gas station, I filled up, thanked the guy, and headed home. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. The missing hours, the eerie silence, the way the night had seemed to swallow me whole. I took my watch to a jeweler the next day, thinking it was broken, but they said it was perfectly fine, ticking away like it should. But I know what I saw. Somehow, I lost nearly 4 hours of my life that night, and to this day, I have no idea where they went. Whenever I drive at night now, I can't help but glance at the clock, half expecting time to slip away from me again. I still don't know what happened out there. But one thing's for sure, time isn't always what it seems. And sometimes, it's better not to know what you might find in those missing minutes. Alright, so let me tell you about the night I swore off driving alone on deserted roads. It was one of those nights where nothing seemed to go right. I was driving back from a long trip, exhausted, and of course, I didn't pay attention to the gas gauge. I figured I'd make it to the next town before refueling, but my car had other plans. The engine sputtered, and just like that, I was coasting to a stop in the middle of nowhere. I pulled over, cursing my luck. The road was completely deserted, not a single car in sight. Just a stretch of highway cutting through dense, shadowy woods. My phone had no signal, and there wasn't a gas station for miles. I sat there for a minute, trying to decide what to do, when I noticed something up ahead, a pair of taillights, faint but unmistakable, glowing through the darkness. Relief washed over me. I wasn't alone out here after all. Maybe whoever was in that car could help. I grabbed my flashlight, got out of the car, and started walking toward the other vehicle. As I got closer, though, something felt off. The car didn't seem right. It was sitting at an odd angle, like it had been abandoned in a hurry. When I finally reached it, I shone my flashlight through the windows, expecting to see someone inside. But the car was empty, completely empty. No sign of life, not even a bag or a jacket left behind. And that's when I noticed the dust. The car was covered in a thick layer of dust, like it hadn't been touched in years. The windows were grimy, the paint was dull, and the tires were half deflated, sunken into the cracked pavement. It didn't make sense. How could a car that looked like it had been sitting there for ages still have its taillights on? I circled the car, shining my light around, trying to find any clue as to what had happened. But there was nothing. No footprints, no signs of recent activity, just that eerie, abandoned vehicle sitting in the middle of the road. A chill ran down my spine, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something about the whole situation just felt wrong, like I had stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to see. I thought about knocking on the windows, calling out, but something in my gut told me to leave it alone. I backed away slowly, keeping my flashlight trained on the car, half expecting someone or something to appear out of the darkness. But nothing did. The night was silent, save for the sound of my own footsteps crunching on the gravel. When I got back to my car, I locked the doors, my heart pounding in my chest. I kept staring at those taillights in the distance, wondering how a car could look like it had been abandoned for years, yet still have power running through it. I tried to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was watching me from the shadows. Eventually, another car came by, and the driver was kind enough to give me a lift to the nearest gas station. But when we drove back to my car with the gas can, the other vehicle was gone. Just like that, it had vanished, leaving no trace behind. No tire marks, no signs it had ever been there. To this day, I can't explain what I saw. I've heard stories about phantom cars and ghostly apparitions, but I never believed in any of that until that night. Now, every time I drive down a dark, empty road, I can't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those taillights again, glowing faintly in the distance. But whatever I saw or didn't see that night, I'm not eager to cross paths with it again. Let me tell you about the most unsettling night I've ever experienced. It was supposed to be a simple drive back from a weekend getaway. I was on this long, lonely stretch of road, surrounded by nothing but fields and the occasional stand of trees. I had been pushing my luck with the gas gauge, thinking I could make it home without stopping, but of course, I was wrong. My car gave a final sputter and came to a stop in the middle of nowhere. At first, I wasn't too worried. It was late, but I had a full tank of patience and a phone with a signal at least. That's what I thought. I pulled over, shut off the engine, and tried calling for a tow truck. The operator assured me they'd send someone out as soon as possible. So, I settled in and waited. That's when the wind started to pick up. It was one of those eerie winds that seems to carry whispers with it, like it's alive. I sat there, the darkness pressing in from all sides. When I first heard it, a soft, disembodied whisper carried on the breeze. It was faint, but clear enough to make out. "Sarah." I froze. My name is Sarah, but I was the only one out here. I looked around, trying to figure out where the voice was coming from. But there was nothing, just the rustling of leaves and the distant howl of the wind. I thought maybe I was imagining things, so I tried to ignore it. But the whispers kept coming. They grew louder and more insistent. "Sarah, come closer." It was as if the wind itself was speaking directly to me, and each time, it sounded more urgent, almost desperate. I started to feel this creeping sense of dread, like I was being watched. My heart was pounding, and I was scanning the darkness, half expecting to see someone or something emerging from the shadows. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just the wind playing tricks on me. The minutes dragged by, and the whispers grew more frantic. "Sarah, help us." It was almost as if the voices were pleading with me. I could feel my nerves fraying, the tension becoming unbearable. I kept telling myself that it was just my imagination, that I was exhausted and scared. Just when the whispers reached a fever pitch, the sound of headlights pierced the darkness. Relief washed over me as the tow truck pulled up beside my car. The driver got out, and the whispers stopped as abruptly as they had begun. The wind fell silent, leaving only the hum of the truck's engine and the clink of tools as the driver went to work. I didn't say anything to the tow truck driver. I was too shaken to talk, and I didn't want to sound crazy. We got my car sorted out and headed back to town. The entire drive was eerily quiet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been waiting for me to leave. I still drive that stretch of road occasionally, but I can't help but feel uneasy whenever the wind picks up. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I think I hear a whisper or two carried on the breeze, calling out, just like before. It's probably nothing, just the wind and my overactive imagination, but I can't shake the feeling that I'm still being watched. And I wonder if those voices were trying to warn me about something, or if they were calling me to something far more sinister. One night, I was on a long-haul route, making my way to a warehouse for a late-night delivery. The journey had been uneventful, and I was looking forward to unloading and getting some rest. I pulled into the warehouse lot, parked my truck, and walked up to the office to check in. I handed over my paperwork to the staff, but they looked confused. They checked their system and told me they had no record of my delivery. I was sure I had the right place, so I double-checked the address and the details. Everything matched up perfectly. I insisted they look again, but they still couldn't find any record of my delivery or the items I was carrying. Frustrated, I asked them to come and inspect the load themselves. We walked back to my truck, and I opened the trailer doors. To my shock, the trailer was completely empty. The entire load I had been transporting had vanished without a trace. The warehouse staff were just as baffled as I was. There were no signs of forced entry, and the seals on the trailer were intact. I felt a chill run down my spine. I knew for certain that the trailer had been loaded when I left, and I had made no stops along the way. It was as if the freight had simply disappeared into thin air. The staff suggested I call my dispatcher to report the incident. When I did, they were equally confused and concerned. They assured me they would look into it, but for the time being, I was left with more questions than answers. I drove to a nearby truck stop, still trying to wrap my head around what had happened. As I sat in my cab, I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that something unnatural had taken place. The missing freight remained a mystery, and despite numerous investigations, it was never found. To this day, I have no explanation for what occurred that night. It was as if the load had been spirited away by some unseen force. The incident left me with a lingering sense of unease, and every time I make a delivery, I can't help but wonder if it will happen again. One night, I was driving my truck down a long, deserted highway. It was past midnight, and the road was eerily quiet. I was in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but darkness, and the hum of my engine for company. Suddenly, I noticed something strange in my rearview mirror. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance, approaching rapidly. At first, I thought it was just another vehicle, but as it got closer, I realized there was something off about it. The lights were blindingly bright, and they seemed to be floating just above the ground. The vehicle got closer and closer, until it was right on my tail. I tried to speed up, but it matched my pace, staying just a few feet behind me. I could feel a cold sweat break out on my forehead as I gripped the steering wheel tighter. I decided to pull over and let the vehicle pass, but when I did, it vanished. There was no sign of it anywhere. I looked around, confused and a little shaken, but there was nothing on the road except my truck and the empty highway stretching into the distance. I got back on the road, trying to shake off the unease, but the headlights reappeared almost immediately, this time in front of me. They hovered for a moment before darting off to the side and disappearing into the darkness. As I continued driving, strange things started happening. The radio crackled with static, and I heard faint whispers that seemed to be coming from the speakers. The temperature in the cab dropped, and I could see my breath in the cold air. Then, out of nowhere, I saw a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, coming to a screeching halt just inches away from the person. But when I got out to check, there was no one there. The road was empty again. I decided to keep driving, determined to reach my destination as quickly as possible. The rest of the night passed without incident, but the experience left me rattled. When I finally arrived at my delivery point, I was exhausted and on edge. I later learned that the stretch of highway I had been driving on was notorious for strange occurrences. There had been numerous reports of ghostly headlights, unexplained figures, and other paranormal phenomena. Some said it was the site of a terrible accident many years ago, and that the spirits of those who died still haunted the road. Even now, I can't explain what I saw that night. The memory of those ghostly headlights and the strange events that followed still haunt me, and I avoid that highway whenever I can. The experience left me with a deep sense of unease, and a belief that there are things out there that can't be explained by logic or reason. One night, I was on a long-haul route, driving through a remote stretch of road that cut through a dense forest. It was the kind of place where the trees seemed to close in on either side, and the only light came from my truck's headlights slicing through the darkness. Around midnight, I saw a sign for a rest area up ahead. Feeling the fatigue setting in, I decided to pull over and take a short break. The rest area was small and deserted, with a couple of picnic tables and a single streetlight casting a dim glow. I parked my truck and stepped out to stretch my legs. As I walked around, I noticed an old, beat-up car parked in the corner, half hidden by the trees. It looked like it had been there for a long time, covered in rust and leaves. I felt a chill run down my spine, but brushed it off as just the eerie atmosphere. After a few minutes, I heard a faint sound coming from the direction of the car. It was a low, rhythmic tapping, like someone gently knocking on metal. I froze, straining my ears to listen. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate. I cautiously approached the car, my heart pounding in my chest. As I got closer, the tapping grew louder. I peered through the grimy windows, but it was too dark to see anything inside. Summoning my courage, I reached for the door handle and pulled. The door creaked open, and I was hit by a musty, stale smell. Inside, the car was empty, but the tapping noise continued, now seeming to come from the trunk. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to walk away, but curiosity got the better of me. I went around to the back of the car and tried the trunk. It was locked. I searched the ground for something to pry it open, and found a rusty crowbar nearby. With a deep breath, I wedged it under the trunk lid and pushed. The trunk sprang open with a groan, and I stumbled back, the tapping noise stopping abruptly. Inside, there was nothing but old, decaying junk. Piles of papers, clothes, and what looked like an old doll stared back at me. I felt a wave of relief and confusion wash over me. Just as I was about to close the trunk, I noticed a piece of paper sticking out from under the debris. I pulled it free and saw it was a photograph of a family, a man, a woman, and a little girl, all smiling happily. But there was something unsettling about their eyes, which seemed to follow me wherever I moved. I shoved the photo back into the trunk and slammed it shut. The tapping had stopped, but the eerie feeling lingered. I hurried back to my truck, eager to get away from the rest area. As I started the engine and pulled back onto the road, I glanced in my rearview mirror. To my horror, I saw the figure of a little girl standing by the old car, staring directly at me. Her eyes were hollow and dark, and her expression was one of sadness and longing. I sped up, watching as she faded into the darkness, the rest area disappearing behind me. The rest of my drive was filled with an overwhelming sense of dread. When I finally reached my destination, I couldn't shake the image of that girl from my mind. I later learned that years ago, a family had disappeared in that area, their car found abandoned at the same rest stop. I still think about that night and wonder if I encountered the spirits of that lost family. The experience left me with a deep unease and a reluctance to stop at remote rest areas alone at night. One late night, I was driving my truck down a lonely stretch of highway. The road was empty, and the only sound was the steady hum of my engine. It was just me, the road, and the occasional crackle of static on the radio. As I was passing through a desolate canyon, I suddenly heard something strange. At first, it was faint, like the wind whispering through the trees, but as I drove further, the sound grew clearer. It was a woman's voice, soft and melodic, singing an old, haunting melody. I glanced at my radio, thinking it had picked up some late-night station, but the display showed nothing but static. The singing continued, the voice seeming to come from all around me. It was beautiful yet unsettling, and I couldn't understand the words, but the tune was deeply melancholic. Curious and a bit unnerved, I slowed down, trying to pinpoint the source of the singing. As I rounded a bend in the road, the voice grew louder, almost as if the singer was right beside me. I scanned the area with my headlights, but there was no one in sight, just the empty road and the towering canyon walls. I kept driving, hoping the voice would fade, but it followed me, never wavering. The singing seemed to wrap around me, filling the cab of my truck with its haunting melody. My heart began to race, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Desperate to shake off the eerie feeling, I turned up the volume on my radio, trying to drown out the voice with static and noise. But it didn't help. The singing persisted, clear and undisturbed by the cacophony. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white, and pressed on the gas, wanting to get out of the canyon as quickly as possible. The voice stayed with me, unrelenting, until I finally saw the canyon walls open up, and the road stretch out into the open desert. As I exited the canyon, the singing abruptly stopped. The silence was jarring, and I almost wished the voice would come back. I drove a few more miles before pulling over to the side of the road, my hands shaking. I took a few deep breaths, trying to calm myself. One evening, I was driving my truck through a remote and desolate stretch of highway. The road was long and straight, with nothing but darkness on either side. The night was quiet, and the only sound was the steady rumble of my engine. As I drove, I noticed an unusual drop in temperature inside the cab. I could see my breath forming in the cold air, which seemed out of place given that it was a relatively mild night. I shrugged it off, thinking it might be a draft or an issue with the truck's climate control. Just then, I felt a sudden, unseen force grip my shoulder. It wasn't a physical touch, but rather an intense pressure, as if someone or something was pressing down on me. I was startled and quickly glanced around, but there was no one in the cab with me. The sensation persisted, making it difficult to concentrate on the road. I tried to shake it off and focus on driving, but the pressure seemed to intensify, almost as if it was trying to pull me away from the wheel. My heart raced, and I gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to maintain control. As I drove, the air grew colder, and the eerie feeling of being watched intensified. I kept glancing in the mirrors, expecting to see someone or something behind me, but there was nothing there. The only other sign of life was the occasional flash of my headlights illuminating the empty road ahead. Eventually, saw the lights of a small town in the distance. The moment I entered the town's limits, the cold air and the pressure on my shoulder abruptly vanished. The whispers stopped, and the atmosphere inside the cab returned to normal. One night, I was driving my truck through a fierce storm. The rain was coming down in sheets, and the wind was howling, making it hard to see more than a few feet in front of me. The road was slick, and I was focusing intently on keeping control of the truck. As I drove, I noticed a figure standing by the roadside, barely visible through the pouring rain. It was a man in a bright yellow raincoat, completely drenched, but standing perfectly still. His appearance was odd, especially given the storm's intensity. Concerned for his safety, I decided to pull over and check on him. I parked the truck and walked over to where he was standing, but when I got there, the man was nowhere to be seen. All that remained were wet footprints in the mud leading to nothing. I looked around, calling out, but there was no sign of anyone. The rain continued to pour down, and the footprints eventually began to wash away. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I realized that the man had disappeared without a trace. I got back in my truck, feeling unsettled, and continued on my way. The storm raged on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something strange had just happened. Later, I tried to make sense of what I had seen, but there was no explanation for the sudden disappearance of the man and the mysterious footprints. One evening, I was driving down a remote road, far from any towns or homes. The area was completely quiet, with only the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. As I rounded a bend, I spotted an abandoned car parked on the side of the road. The car was running, and the doors were wide open. It looked like it had been left in a hurry. I slowed down and pulled over to take a closer look, feeling a growing sense of unease. There was no sign of anyone around, and the area was unsettlingly still. I got out of my truck and approached the abandoned vehicle. Inside, the car was empty, and there were no personal belongings or obvious signs of what had happened. The engine was still idling, and the rain was beginning to fall, making the situation even more eerie. I checked the surrounding area, hoping to find some clue about the driver's whereabouts, but there was nothing. It was as if the driver had vanished into thin air. The car felt almost like a ghostly remnant of a previous occupant. Feeling uneasy, got back in my truck and continued on my way. Later, I learned that the car had been reported stolen and was connected to a missing persons case. The news made the whole experience even more unsettling, knowing that the abandoned vehicle was linked to something so serious and mysterious. To this day, I can't shake the feeling of that eerie silence and the abandoned car left on that lonely road. The whole incident has left me with a lingering sense of unease whenever I drive through remote areas. Later, I discovered more details about the abandoned car. It turned out that the vehicle had been stolen a few days before I found it. The car had belonged to a young woman who had been reported missing under mysterious circumstances. The story behind the car was tragic. The woman had been driving home from work one evening when she disappeared. The car was found not far from where I had encountered it, with no sign of her ever having left it. Investigators were baffled by the lack of evidence and leads. The abandoned car, still running with the doors open, was linked to her disappearance. Authorities later determined that the vehicle had been left there intentionally, perhaps as a clue or a message. The case attracted significant media attention, and search efforts were intensified, but the woman was never found. As the investigation continued, theories emerged that she might have been taken by someone she knew or encountered someone dangerous on that remote road. Despite numerous leads and searches, the case remained unsolved. The whole experience left me with a deep sense of foreboding. Knowing that the car was tied to such a heartbreaking story made the encounter even more unsettling. Whenever I drive through remote areas now, I can't help but think of that abandoned vehicle and the mystery surrounding it.